When I moved into my new apartment last fall, the place seemed perfect. It was a small, one-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for a fresh start after my recent breakup. Everything was clean, cozy, and peaceful, except for one thing: the man across the street. I first noticed him after about a week. He lived in the house directly opposite mine, an old, run-down building with paint peeling off the walls. Every night, I would see him standing in the window, staring out into the street. He never seemed to move. His silhouette was always there, just standing still, as if waiting for something, or someone. At first, I tried to shrug it off. I told myself it was probably just an old man with nothing better to do. But as the days went by, it became harder to ignore. No matter when I looked out my window, whether it was morning, afternoon, or late at night, he was always there, watching. One evening, after coming home from a late shift at work, I couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze was directed at me. I closed my curtains, but it did little to ease my anxiety. I even tried to avoid looking in his direction altogether, but curiosity always got the better of me. Each time I peeked, there he was, his shadowy form unchanging, except now I was certain he was staring at my window. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront him. I crossed the street, my heart pounding, and knocked on his door. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, but the house was silent. After a few moments, I tried the doorknob. It was locked. Frustrated, I returned to my apartment. As I passed my window, I glanced up. He was gone. For the first time in weeks, the window was empty. That night, I slept uneasily. Around 3 a.m. I was woken by the sound of tapping. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, listening closely. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, coming from my window. I forced myself to look, and there he was, standing directly outside my window, staring in at me. His face was pressed against the glass, his breath fogging up the pane. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on mine. I screamed and scrambled to the door, calling the police. They arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. They searched the area and questioned the neighbors, but no one had seen him. In the days that followed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined him standing outside, watching me. I installed new locks, got a security system, but the fear never left me. Eventually, I moved out. The last time I looked at that house, his window was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, waiting. I've never been the type to complain about noise. Living in an apartment building, you get used to the sounds of people living their lives, kids running down the hall, doors slamming, music playing. But there was something different about the noise coming from my new neighbors. They moved in at the end of summer. A young couple, quiet and polite. They didn't stand out at first, but after a week or two, I started hearing strange sounds coming from their apartment. It was always at night, usually around midnight. It sounded like a party, loud music, laughter, the clinking of glasses. At first, I didn't think much of it. They were probably just having friends over, I told myself. But it kept happening, night after night, always at the same time. And the strange thing was, I never saw any guests going in or out of their apartment. One night, the noise was louder than ever. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to go knock on their door and ask them to keep it down. As I stepped into the hallway, the noise stopped. Complete silence. I stood there for a moment, confused, before knocking. No one answered. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Frustrated, I went back to my apartment. As soon as I closed the door, the noise started up again. This time, it sounded even closer, like it was coming from right outside my door. I opened the door again, silence. This went on for days. Every night, the noise would start, and every time I tried to investigate, it would stop. I asked other neighbors about it, but no one else seemed to hear anything. It was like I was the only one who could hear the party. One night, after another sleepless night, I decided to confront the couple. I knocked on their door during the day this time, and they answered immediately, looking confused and concerned. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said, "but there's been a lot of noise coming from your apartment at night. It sounds like a party." They exchanged glances before the woman spoke. "We don't throw parties," she said softly. "We don't even stay up that late." I didn't know what to say. I apologized and left, feeling more unsettled than ever. That night, the noise started again, louder than ever before. This time, I couldn't take it. I grabbed my phone and recorded the sounds, hoping to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. But when I played the recording back, there was nothing, just silence. I moved out a few weeks later. I couldn't take the noise anymore. But the strangest part? After I moved, I found out from another neighbor that the apartment had been empty for months. The couple I thought had moved in. They never existed. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I didn't know anyone. It was a quiet street, filled with families who mostly kept to themselves. But my next-door neighbor, Mr. Peterson, was different. He was an older man, always friendly, always willing to chat. He seemed normal enough, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. He was too eager to help, too interested in my life. And then there was the basement. Every time I passed his house, I noticed that his basement windows were covered with thick black curtains. I never saw any light coming from them, and there was always a strange smell lingering in the air. One evening, Mr. Peterson invited me over for dinner. I didn't want to go, but I didn't know how to say no. His house was clean, almost too clean, and the dinner was awkward. He kept asking me personal questions, things that felt invasive. But what bothered me the most was the basement door. It was locked, and he seemed nervous every time I glanced in its direction. After dinner, I made an excuse to leave, but as I was walking out, I heard something. A faint noise, coming from the basement. It sounded like crying. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. Mr. Peterson noticed and quickly stepped in front of me, smiling. "Old pipes," he said, his voice too cheerful. "This house is full of creaks and groans." I nodded, but the sound haunted me. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the basement. The noises, the smell, it didn't add up. I started watching his house more closely, and I noticed something strange. Every few nights, he would leave late, around midnight, carrying large black bags out to his car. He would drive off, returning hours later, the bags gone. One night, my curiosity got the better of me. I waited until he left and decided to sneak into his backyard. I found one of the basement windows and tried to peer inside, but the curtains were too thick. Desperate, I pried the window open and slipped inside. The basement was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay. I felt my way along the walls until I found a light switch. When the lights flickered on, I saw them, cages. Small, rusted cages, lining the walls. And inside them, bones. Small, animal-like bones, scattered across the floor. But that wasn't the worst part. In the far corner, there was a single, larger cage, with a heavy lock on the door. And inside, huddled in the corner, was a woman. She was alive, barely, her eyes wide with fear. I ran out of there as fast as I could, calling the police as soon as I was safe. They found her, along with evidence of other victims. Mr. Peterson was arrested, but the nightmares never left me. To this day, I can still hear the sound of crying from that basement. I had always been a light sleeper, so when I moved into my first solo apartment, the noises of city life took some getting used to. The distant sounds of traffic, the occasional shouting from a passerby, and the hum of apartment life had become normal after a few weeks. But there was one sound that stood out, and it came from my upstairs neighbor. Every night, like clockwork around 1 a.m. I would hear it. A scraping sound, like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. It would start softly, then grow louder, almost violent, before abruptly stopping. At first, I thought maybe they were moving things around, but when it happened night after night, I started to get suspicious. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I decided to go upstairs and ask my neighbor what the noise was about. I'd never met them before, an older woman, my landlord had said. She'd lived there for over 30 years, always kept to herself. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I decided to leave a note, politely asking her to keep the noise down late at night. The next few nights were peaceful. No scraping, no strange sounds. I almost forgot about it, until it started again. But this time, it was different. The scraping noise wasn't just coming from the ceiling. It was closer, more distinct. I lay there in bed, my heart pounding as I realized it was coming from the walls. I could hear it, faint but unmistakable, moving from one side of the room to the other. Then, it stopped, and everything went silent. The next day, I saw my landlord in the hallway and asked him if he'd heard anything from the neighbor. He looked confused and shook his head. That apartment's been empty for weeks, he said. Mrs. Wallace passed away last month. My stomach dropped. Are you sure? I've been hearing noises from up there every night. He frowned. There's no one up there. The place is locked up. I'm getting it ready for new tenants. I didn't know what to say. That night, the scraping came again, louder and more insistent. I lay there, frozen in my bed, listening as the sound moved across my ceiling, then down the walls. My pulse quickened as it stopped right above me. I held my breath, waiting, but all I heard was silence. The next day, I decided to go up to the apartment myself. I knocked on the door again, but of course, no one answered. The building was old, and I managed to slip a credit card into the door frame, jimmying the lock open. Inside, the apartment was empty. Dust covered the floors, and the furniture was covered in sheets. I walked slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I moved toward the bedroom, that same scraping noise began, faint at first but growing louder with each step. I stopped at the door, and there, in the center of the room, was an old, wooden dresser. It was pushed up against the far wall, but there were deep scratches on the floor, leading from the center of the room to where it now stood. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong. I reached out to touch the dresser, but before I could, I heard it, a soft, raspy whisper coming from behind it. I bolted from the apartment and never went back. A week later, I moved out. I don't know what was in that apartment, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of scraping. When the new neighbor moved in, something felt off right away. It wasn't that he was unfriendly, quite the opposite. He was polite, always offering a wave or a nod when we passed each other. But there was something unsettling about him that I couldn't put my finger on. His name was Mr. Jennings. He moved in on a rainy September day, keeping mostly to himself. He never had visitors, and I never saw him leave his apartment except to go to work. His curtains were always drawn, and there was a strange, musty smell that seemed to seep out from under his door. At first, I ignored it. People have their quirks, I told myself. But then the noises started. Late at night, just past midnight, I would hear shuffling sounds coming from his apartment. It was faint, almost like someone dragging their feet across the floor. And then, there was the knocking. It would start as a gentle tap, almost like someone tapping their fingers on the wall. But as the nights went on, it grew louder, more frantic. The knocking would move from one side of the apartment to the other, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it would stop. One night, the knocking was particularly loud, and it seemed to be coming from the wall directly behind my bed. I couldn't take it anymore. I knocked back, hard, hoping to get Mr. Jennings' attention. To my surprise, the knocking stopped. I waited for a few moments, listening to the silence, but there was no sound. The next morning, I decided to talk to him. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. After waiting for a few minutes, I left. But later that day, I saw him coming home from work. I approached him, trying to be polite. "Hey, Mr. Jennings," I said. "I've been hearing some strange noises from your apartment at night. I was wondering if everything's okay." He looked at me with a strange, almost vacant expression. His eyes were dull, and his skin had a sickly, grayish hue. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said flatly before walking past me and into his apartment. That night, the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't just on the walls, it was on my door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as the knocks grew louder. I crept toward the door, peeking through the peephole, but there was no one there. The knocking continued, relentless and insistent. Finally, I threw open the door, no one. I looked toward Mr. Jennings' apartment, but the door was shut, and everything was quiet. I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm my nerves, when I noticed something odd. The doormat in front of his apartment wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was a long, thin drag mark leading from his door down the hallway. I followed the mark, my pulse quickening as it led to the basement stairs. The door was slightly ajar, and there was a faint, wet sound coming from below. I knew I shouldn't go down there, but I couldn't stop myself. I descended the stairs, my hand trembling as I gripped the railing. At the bottom, in the dim light, I saw him, Mr. Jennings. He was hunched over, his back to me, dragging something heavy across the floor. My heart leapt into my throat when I saw what it was, a body, wrapped in a thick, plastic sheet. I backed away, trying to stay silent, but I must have made a noise because he froze. Slowly, he turned, and his eyes locked onto mine. They weren't dull anymore. They were black, empty, and full of malice. I ran out of there as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The police found no trace of Mr. Jennings or the body, and the apartment was cleaned out within days. But I still hear the knocking, late at night, as if he's still there, waiting. Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.